My wife said I was paranoid about her work friend. I proved I'd been right all along and she had no idea. I met Daniel Crowley at a neighborhood barbecue 6 weeks after my wife Rachel started her new job at Meridian Financial Group. She introduced him as her mentor, the senior analyst who'd taken her under his wing during her first month. He had dark hair graying at the temples, an expensive watch, and a handshake that lasted 3 seconds too long. Rachel laughed at everything he said. I watched her touch his arm twice during a conversation about quarterly projections. When I mentioned it later that night, she rolled her eyes and called me insecure. That was the first time she used that word against me. The texts started appearing at odd hours. Rachel would check her phone during dinner, smile at the screen, and type rapid responses while I was mid-sentence. When I asked who she was talking to, she'd say, "Just work stuff," without looking up. Daniel's name appeared constantly. Daniel thinks I should lead the client presentation. Daniel recommended this restaurant. Daniel said the funniest thing today. I told her it seemed excessive for a work relationship. She asked why I was threatened by her having a successful career. The conversation ended with her sleeping in the guest room. I started paying closer attention. Rachel began working late 3 nights a week, always on projects Daniel was supervising. She bought new clothes, expensive pieces that seemed too formal for her usual office environment. She started going to the gym at 6 in the morning, coming home with wet hair and flushed cheeks. When I suggested we needed to talk about the distance growing between us, she said I was being paranoid and controlling. She made me feel crazy for noticing patterns that seemed obvious. Her sister told me I should trust Rachel more. Her best friend said I was being possessive. Even my own brother suggested I was overreacting to normal workplace friendships. 3 months into Rachel's new job, I found a receipt in her coat pocket for a hotel restaurant downtown. The date was from a Tuesday she'd told me she was working late at the office. The receipt showed 2 entrees, 2 glasses of wine, and the meal lasted from 7 until nearly 10 at night. When I asked about it, Rachel said Daniel had taken her there to celebrate closing a major client deal. She acted offended that I'd even question it. She said the dinner was completely professional and I was being ridiculous for suggesting otherwise. I apologized for bringing it up. I actually apologized to her. I couldn't let it go. I started checking our credit card statements and noticed charges at places Rachel claimed she'd never been. A coffee shop across from Daniel's apartment building. A wine bar that Rachel had specifically told me she'd never tried when I'd suggested going there for our anniversary. Parking garage fees near the Marriott downtown on afternoons. She said she was at the office. When I confronted her with the credit card evidence, Rachel exploded. She screamed that I was tracking her movements like a psychopath. She said I needed therapy for my trust issues. She threatened to leave me if I didn't stop being so controlling and jealous. I backed off for a week. Rachel seemed relieved, almost smug about winning the argument. Then her phone rang during breakfast on a Saturday morning. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. She grabbed it quickly and walked into the other room. I heard her laughing, speaking in a low voice I recognized from when we first started dating. She stayed on the phone for 40 minutes while her coffee went cold on the kitchen table. When she came back, she said Daniel needed advice about a personal situation. I asked what kind of personal situation required a 40-minute call on a weekend. She told me I was being controlling again and left the house without saying where she was going. That afternoon, I made a decision I'm not proud of. I created a fake email account and sent a message to Daniel through the Meridian Financial website contact form. I claimed to be a potential client interested in investment services and requested a meeting at his earliest convenience. Daniel responded within an hour with his cell phone number and availability. I called from a burner phone I'd bought at a convenience store and scheduled a consultation for the following Wednesday at 2 in the afternoon. I told him I was recently divorced and looking to invest a substantial inheritance. He sounded eager and professional on the phone. The meeting took place at a coffee shop, Daniel suggested, not at the Meridian office. He arrived wearing a dark suit and carrying a leather portfolio. I'd borrowed my brother's car and worn glasses I didn't need along with a baseball cap pulled low. Daniel didn't recognize me from the barbecue months earlier. We shook hands, and he launched into a presentation about investment strategies and portfolio management. I asked questions about his client base and whether he handled many high-net-worth individuals. He assured me he had extensive experience with wealthy clients and could provide references if needed. I told him I'd need to think about it and would be in touch. As I was leaving, I asked casually if he worked with many colleagues at Meridian. Daniel mentioned he was training a promising new analyst named Rachel, who showed real potential. He smiled when he said her name. I asked if he mentored junior employees often. Daniel said he was selective about who he invested time in, but Rachel was special, very dedicated and willing to put in extra hours to learn the business. The way he emphasized extra hours made my stomach turn. I thanked him for his time and left before my anger showed on my face. I spent the next week gathering information. I created a fake LinkedIn profile posing as a recruiter and connected with people who worked at Meridian Financial. I found a woman named Jennifer who'd left the company 6 months earlier. I sent her a direct message asking general questions about the work culture there. She responded with a long message warning me that certain senior analysts had reputations for inappropriate relationships with junior staff. When I pressed for details, Jennifer said Daniel Crowley specifically had been involved with at least 2 younger female employees during her time there. Both relationships ended badly when the women realized Daniel had no intention of leaving his wife. I I read that message 3 times. Daniel had a wife. Rachel knew Daniel had a wife. She'd met his wife at a company holiday party and told me afterwards how nice she seemed. I went back through my memories of every conversation about Daniel and realized Rachel had carefully avoided mentioning his wife after that one party. She'd stopped saying Daniel and his wife and started just saying Daniel. The omission felt deliberate and damning. I wondered if Rachel knew about the other women or if she believed she was different, special, the one he'd actually leave his wife for. I hired a private investigator named Gordon, who came highly recommended from a lawyer friend. Gordon was in his 50s, ex-police, and completely matter-of-fact about infidelity cases. He said he'd need 2 weeks and $3,000 to get me concrete evidence. I gave him photos of Rachel and Daniel, their work schedules, and the addresses I'd found. Gordon said he'd start surveillance immediately and would contact me only if he found something definitive. I went home that night and acted completely normal. Rachel was in a good mood, talking about a promotion opportunity she was being considered for. I smiled and said I was proud of her. Gordon called me 9 days later and asked me to meet him at his office. He had a folder on his desk filled with photographs. The first image showed Rachel and Daniel entering the Marriott Hotel downtown at 1:15 on a Thursday afternoon. The timestamp matched a day Rachel had texted me saying she'd be working late. The next photo showed them leaving the hotel at 4:30. Rachel's hair was different, messier, and Daniel had his hand on her lower back. Gordon flipped through more images. Rachel and Daniel having lunch at an outdoor cafe, sitting on the same side of the booth. Rachel and Daniel in his car, parked at a scenic overlook, her head on his shoulder. Rachel and Daniel kissing in the parking garage I'd seen charged to our credit card. Gordon pulled out his laptop and showed me video footage he'd captured from a distance. Rachel and Daniel walking hand in hand through a park. Rachel and Daniel dancing together at a bar I'd never heard of. Rachel laughing and kissing Daniel's neck while they waited for a traffic light to change. The footage was dated and time-stamped. Gordon had documented 16 separate meetings over 9 days, including 3 hotel visits, 5 restaurant meals, and numerous public displays of affection. He said this was one of the more blatant affairs he'd documented, almost like they wanted to be seen. I paid him his fee and took copies of everything. I sat in my car outside Gordon's office and called Rachel's sister Emma. I told her I needed to talk to her urgently about Rachel and asked if she could meet me that evening. Emma sounded worried and agreed to come to our house after work. I drove home and organized all the evidence on my laptop, creating a folder with the photos, videos, credit card statements, and the information Jennifer had sent me about Daniel's history. Then, I texted Rachel asking what time she'd be home. She responded that she had a late meeting and wouldn't be back until after 8. I asked if it was with Daniel. She said yes and added a comment about me needing to get over my jealousy issues. Emma arrived at 6, and I showed her everything. She watched the videos in silence, her face going pale as each clip played. She looked at the hotel photos and credit card statements. When I finished the presentation, Emma sat back on the couch and covered her face with her hands. She apologized for calling me paranoid. She said she'd noticed changes in Rachel, but assumed it was just stress from the new job. She asked what I was going to do. I told her I needed her help confronting Rachel with someone else present as a witness. Emma agreed immediately, saying she was furious with her sister for destroying her marriage and lying to everyone. Rachel came home at 8:30. She walked into the living room and froze when she saw Emma sitting next to me on the couch. She asked what was going on, her voice sharp with defensiveness. I picked up my laptop and turned the screen toward her. The first photo showed her and Daniel kissing in the parking garage. Rachel's face drained of color. She started to say something, but I clicked to the next image. Hotel entrance. Next image. Restaurant booth. Next image. Daniel's car. I went through 20 photos without saying a word while Rachel stood there trembling. Emma spoke first, her voice shaking with anger. She asked Rachel how she could do this to her marriage, to her husband, to her family. Rachel's shock transformed into defiance. She said I had violated her privacy by hiring someone to follow her. I asked if she was seriously making herself the victim in this situation. Rachel said I'd been controlling and paranoid for months, practically pushing her toward Daniel with my constant accusations. She claimed the affair started because I'd made her feel trapped and suffocated in our marriage. Emma told Rachel to stop making excuses for cheating. Rachel turned on her sister and said she didn't understand what it was like to be in a marriage where your husband didn't trust you. I asked Rachel how long the affair had been going on. She refused to answer. I told her Gordon's surveillance showed hotel visits going back at least 3 weeks, but the credit card statements suggested it had been happening for months before that. Rachel's hands were shaking. She said it wasn't supposed to be like this, that Daniel had told her he was leaving his wife and they were going to be together. Emma laughed bitterly and told Rachel about the message from Jennifer, about the other junior employees Daniel had seduced with the same promises. Rachel's face changed from defiant to uncertain. She asked what I meant about other women. I showed Rachel the LinkedIn messages, Jennifer's warning about Daniel's pattern, the mention of at least 2 previous affairs with younger colleagues. Rachel read the messages, and I watched her realize she wasn't special, just the latest in a series. She sat down heavily on the chair across from us. I asked if Daniel had ever actually done anything concrete about leaving his wife, like talking to a lawyer or looking at apartments. Rachel admitted he hadn't. She said they were waiting for the right time. I asked how long they'd been waiting for the right time. Rachel whispered that Daniel had been promising to leave his wife for 4 months now. Emma asked if Rachel had any idea what she'd thrown away. A 7-year marriage to someone who loved her, who'd supported her career change, who'd never cheated or lied or betrayed her trust. Rachel started crying and said she'd made a mistake. I told her it wasn't one mistake, it was hundreds of choices over months to lie, cheat, and gaslight me into thinking I was crazy for noticing obvious signs. Rachel said she was sorry and begged me not to give up on us. I asked if she'd ended things with Daniel. She said no, not officially, but she would right now if I wanted her to. I told her it was too late for that. I pulled up an email I'd drafted earlier and showed it to Rachel. The email was addressed to Daniel's wife, Susan, and it contained a selection of the photos and videos Gordon had captured, along with a brief explanation that I was Rachel's husband and thought Susan deserved to know what her husband had been doing. Rachel panicked and grabbed for my laptop. She begged me not to send it, saying it would destroy Daniel's family. I pointed out that Daniel had already destroyed his own family, and mine, and didn't seem particularly concerned about either. Emma said Susan had a right to know the truth. Rachel pleaded with me to think about what this would do to Daniel's career, his reputation, his children. I asked Rachel if she'd thought about any of those things while she was sleeping with him in hotel rooms. She had no answer. I asked if Daniel had considered his children when he was kissing her in parking garages. Rachel cried harder but couldn't defend him. I moved my cursor to the send button and looked at Rachel. I told her she had one chance to tell me the complete truth about everything. How long the affair had lasted, how many times they'd been together, what Daniel had promised her, and whether she'd planned to leave me. For him. If she told me the truth right now, I'd give her 5 minutes to call Daniel and end things before I sent the email. If she lied or held anything back, I'd send it immediately. Rachel took a shuddering breath and told me everything. The affair started 2 months into her new job. Daniel had asked her to work late on a presentation and ordered dinner to the office. They'd talked for hours, and he'd kissed her in the conference room. She'd pulled away initially, but he'd pursued her, sending texts saying he hadn't felt this way in years, that his marriage was dead, and he was only staying for his kids. Within a week, they were meeting at hotels during lunch breaks. Rachel said she'd fallen for Daniel's attention and experience. He made her feel important and valued in a way she said I hadn't been doing lately. I asked how many times they'd been together. Rachel estimated at least 30 times, maybe more. Sometimes just for an hour at lunch, other times for entire afternoons when they both called in sick to work. Daniel had taken her to expensive restaurants in other towns where they wouldn't run into anyone from the office. He'd bought her jewelry she kept in her desk drawer at work. He'd promised her they'd get an apartment together once his divorce was finalized. Rachel said she'd believed him completely until about 3 weeks ago when she started noticing he'd make excuses whenever she brought up concrete plans. He'd say his lawyer advised waiting. He'd say his wife was being difficult. He'd say the timing wasn't right. Emma asked if Rachel had intended to leave me. Rachel said she didn't know, that she'd been living in a fantasy where somehow everything would work out without anyone getting hurt. I asked if she loved Daniel. Rachel hesitated, then said she thought she did, but now she wasn't sure if it was love or just the excitement of the affair. I asked if she still loved me. Rachel said yes, immediately, emphatically. She said she'd never stopped loving me, but had convinced herself that what was happening with Daniel was separate from our marriage, like 2 different parts of her life that didn't affect each other. I told her that was the most delusional thing I'd ever heard. I handed Rachel my phone and told her to call Daniel right now and end it while Emma and I listened. Rachel's hands shook as she dialed. Daniel answered on the second ring, his voice warm and intimate. Rachel's voice cracked as she told him they needed to stop seeing each other, that her husband knew everything and it was over. Daniel's tone changed immediately. He asked if I was there listening. Rachel said yes. Daniel said they should talk in person, that she was making a rash decision under pressure. Rachel told him there was nothing to talk about, that she was staying with her husband, and he needed to respect that. Daniel's voice turned cold. He said she was making a big mistake and would regret throwing away what they had. Then he hung up without saying goodbye. Rachel stared at her phone like she'd never seen it before. I watched her process Daniel's response, the complete absence of concern for her well-being or remorse for the situation. Emma asked if that sounded like a man who was ready to leave his wife and start a new life. Rachel shook her head slowly. I asked if she noticed how quickly Daniel turned hostile when she tried to end things on her terms instead of his. Rachel started crying again, but this time it seemed different, like she was mourning the loss of an illusion rather than an actual relationship. I told her to go upstairs and pack a bag. She was staying at Emma's house for the next few days while I decided what I wanted to do. Rachel left with Emma an hour later. I sat alone in our house and opened my laptop. The email to Daniel's wife Susan was still in my drafts folder. I read through it one more time, checking that the photos were properly attached and the message was clear without being cruel. Then I added one more line. I thought you deserved to know the truth about what your husband has been doing. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this. I clicked send and watched the email disappear from my outbox. It was done. Whatever happened next was out of my hands. Susan called me the next morning at 7. Her voice was raw from crying, but she thanked me for telling her the truth. She said she'd suspected Daniel was having an affair, but had no proof, and he'd convinced her she was being paranoid. The photos I'd sent confirmed everything she'd feared. Susan said she'd confronted Daniel the night before, and he'd admitted to the affair with Rachel, but swore it was over and meant nothing. She'd told him to get out of the house. They had 2 teenage daughters who were devastated and confused. Susan asked if I knew about the other women Daniel had been involved with at work. I sent her Jennifer's LinkedIn messages. Susan called back an hour later. She'd contacted Jennifer and gotten names of the other women Daniel had affairs with. One of them still worked at Meridian Financial and confirmed that Daniel had promised to leave his wife for her too, but eventually ghosted her when she got too demanding about timelines. The other woman had quit after Daniel's interest suddenly cooled, and he started avoiding her at work. Susan said she was taking copies of everything to a divorce lawyer that afternoon. She also said she was considering reporting Daniel to Meridian's HR department for having relationships with subordinates, which violated company policy. She asked if Rachel would be willing to provide a statement. I said I'd ask. I called Rachel at Emma's house. She sounded exhausted. I told her about my conversations with Susan and the information about Daniel's previous affairs. Rachel was quiet for a long time. Then she asked if I thought she should cooperate with Susan's HR complaint against Daniel. I said that was her decision, but she should know Daniel had used his position of power to seduce multiple junior employees with the same lies he'd told her. Rachel said she needed time to think about it. I told her she had 24 hours to decide if she wanted to be part of exposing Daniel's pattern or if she wanted to protect him one last time. Rachel called me back that evening. She said she'd been thinking about everything and realized Daniel had manipulated her from the start. The late-night texts, the special attention, the promises about leaving his wife, all of it was a calculated strategy he'd perfected on other women before her. She felt stupid and used. She said she'd provide a statement to HR detailing how Daniel had initiated the relationship, the pressure she'd felt as a junior employee to respond to his advances, and the promises he'd made about their future together. Rachel said she didn't expect this to change anything between us, but she wanted to do the right thing for once. I met with Susan 3 days later at a coffee shop. She brought her lawyer, a sharp woman in her 50s named Patricia, who specialized in divorce cases involving infidelity and financial misconduct. Patricia said Susan had a strong case for divorce based on Daniel's adultery and could potentially pursue financial compensation beyond standard asset division, given his pattern of deception. She asked if I was planning to divorce Rachel. I said I didn't know yet. Patricia nodded and said I should think about what I wanted long-term, not just how I felt in the immediate aftermath of discovering the affair. She gave me her card and said to call if I needed legal advice. Susan looked older than her photos on social media, her face drawn and tired. She thanked me again for sending the evidence. She said finding out through photos was brutal but better than continuing to live in ignorance while Daniel made a fool of her. Susan told me Daniel had been love-bombing her since she kicked him out, sending flowers and apology texts, claiming the affair was a midlife crisis, and Rachel had pursued him aggressively. I showed Susan the credit card statements and timeline of events proving Daniel had initiated and maintained the relationship. Susan's mouth tightened into a grim line. She said Daniel was a liar and a coward, and she planned to take him for everything he had. Rachel submitted her statement to Meridian's HR department on Monday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Daniel was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. By Thursday, 2 more women had come forward with similar stories about Daniel's inappropriate relationships and broken promises. One had emails explicitly detailing Daniel's advances and promises to leave his wife. The other had text messages showing Daniel pressuring her to keep their relationship secret from colleagues. Meridian's HR director called Rachel to thank her for having the courage to come forward. The company was taking the matter very seriously and would be conducting a thorough review of Daniel's conduct. I followed the situation from a distance through Susan, who kept me updated via text. Daniel hired an expensive lawyer and tried to fight the HR investigation, claiming the relationships were consensual and happened outside work hours. Meridian's legal team argued that Daniel had violated the company's ethics policy by pursuing relationships with direct reports and creating a hostile work environment. 3 weeks after the investigation began, Meridian terminated Daniel's employment for gross misconduct. His severance package was voided due to the ethics violations. Susan's lawyer filed for divorce the same day, citing adultery and requesting full custody of their daughters. Rachel called me 2 weeks after Daniel was fired. She'd been staying at Emma's apartment and giving me space to process everything. She said she'd started seeing a therapist to understand why she'd sabotaged her marriage and made such destructive choices. Her therapist told her she'd been seeking external validation because she didn't feel confident in herself or our relationship. Rachel admitted she'd taken me for granted and stopped appreciating what we had together. She said she understood if I couldn't forgive her but wanted a chance to prove she could change. I told her I needed more time and ended the call. My brother encouraged me to file for divorce immediately, while the evidence was fresh. He said Rachel had destroyed our trust completely, and I'd never be able to look at her the same way. My best friend said some marriages survived infidelity if both people committed to rebuilding. My therapist, who I'd started seeing weekly, said only I could decide if the marriage was worth saving or if the betrayal was too fundamental to overcome. I made lists of reasons to stay and reasons to leave. The reasons to leave were longer and more concrete. The reasons to stay felt like clinging to who Rachel used to be, rather than accepting who she'd shown herself to be. I asked Rachel to meet me for coffee 6 weeks after everything had exploded. She looked thinner and wasn't wearing makeup. We sat across from each other and I told her I'd made a decision. I was filing for divorce. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded like she'd expected it. I explained that I couldn't rebuild trust with someone who'd lied to my face for months and tried to convince me I was crazy for noticing obvious signs. The gaslighting hurt worse than the affair itself because it made me doubt my own perception of reality. Rachel said she understood and didn't blame me. She asked if there was anything she could do to change my mind. I said no. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Rachel didn't contest anything. She moved to a smaller apartment across town and requested a transfer to a different department at Meridian to avoid running into colleagues who knew about the Daniel situation. We split our assets evenly and had no children to complicate custody arrangements. The paperwork felt anticlimactic after the intensity of discovering the affair. I signed the final documents in my lawyer's office and felt nothing except tired relief that it was over. Daniel's divorce took longer because Susan was fighting for maximum financial compensation and full custody. His daughters refused to speak to him after learning details about his multiple affairs and lies. Daniel tried to get hired at several competing financial firms, but his termination for ethics violations kept coming up in background checks. Susan's lawyer told me Daniel had taken a significant pay cut at a smaller company in another state, essentially starting his career over at 46. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, just a dull acknowledgement that actions have consequences. I ran into Rachel's mother at a grocery store 8 months after our divorce was finalized. She looked uncomfortable but stopped to talk. She apologized for not reaching out sooner and said she was ashamed of what Rachel had done to our marriage. She asked how I was doing. I said I was fine, dating someone new, focusing on my work. Rachel's mother nodded and said Rachel was struggling but seemed genuinely remorseful. She asked if I'd ever consider speaking to Rachel, not about reconciliation but just to give her closure. I said Rachel had closure the day our divorce was finalized, and I had nothing left to say to her. I sold our house a year after the divorce and moved to a condo downtown. The fresh start felt necessary, being in a space that didn't have memories of Rachel in every room. I changed my phone number and blocked Rachel on all social media. My new girlfriend knew the broad strokes of what happened, but I didn't dwell on it. She appreciated that I'd trusted my instincts despite everyone telling me I was paranoid. She said it showed character that I'd gathered evidence before making accusations and gave Rachel a chance to come clean. I told her I'd learned to trust my gut and never let someone gaslight me into doubting what I could clearly see. 2 years after everything fell apart, I received a LinkedIn message from Jennifer, the woman who'd first warned me about Daniel's pattern of affairs. She said she'd heard through the grapevine that Daniel had been fired from his new job for similar misconduct with a junior colleague. Apparently, he'd learned nothing from destroying 2 marriages and multiple careers. Jennifer said she was glad I'd exposed him when I did, because who knows how many more women he would have manipulated otherwise. I thanked her for the original warning and said I hoped Daniel's pattern was finally documented enough that no company would hire him. Jennifer said karma had a way of catching up to people who thought they were untouchable. I thought about Rachel sometimes, wondering if she'd learned anything or if she'd simply found someone new to blame for her choices. Emma told me Rachel had moved to a different city for a fresh start and was dating someone from a completely different industry. I hoped she'd figured out whatever was broken inside her that made her throw away a good marriage for empty promises from a serial cheater. But mostly, I didn't think about her at all. I'd built a new life that didn't include space for someone who'd looked me in the eye and called me paranoid while proving every suspicion I had was justified. My instincts had been right all along. That validation mattered more than any apology Rachel could have offered. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.